Pursuit of Spring, where the ecologist Matthew Oates celebrates the centenary of naturalist and poet Edward Thomas's iconic cycle ride from South London to Somerset over Easter 1913.
It is not yet spring. Spring is being dreamed, and the dream is more wonderful and more blessed than ever was spring. What the hour of waking will bring forth is not known. Catch at the dreams as they hover.
Edward Thomas was one of the most accomplished and profound writers on the countryside, with a unique poetic prose style. In 1913, Thomas embarked upon what became his last prose journey, In Pursuit of Spring, an account of a 130-mile cycle ride from South London westwards to the Quantocks in Somerset. Thomas undertook this journey over the Easter weekend of 1913. His mission was to find spring, but he saw, found, touched, and achieved much more. I'm Matthew Oates, a naturalist working for the National Trust, follower of the poetic approach to nature, and one long fascinated by Edward Thomas's way of looking at the world. In this, the centenary year of Thomas's ride, it would be difficult to conduct a faithful reenactment of his journey on account of modern traffic. And my journey must be in the spirit of Edward Thomas's 1913 ride. My journey in pursuit of spring begins here by the Edward Thomas Memorial Stone on the shoulder of Mutton Hill above Petersfield in East Hampshire on Sunday the 3rd of March, which just happens to be Edward Thomas's birthday. I'm waiting for the Edward Thomas Fellowship to arrive here at the stone because they visit every year around his birthday.
The first is an extract from the Icknield Way, Chapter 1 on roads and footpaths.
I'm Sophie Milner, Edward's great-great-granddaughter.
Edward Thomas's great-great-granddaughter.
Yes.
What does he mean to you? How proud of him are you?
Well, immensely proud. I'm doing English, studying that, so
Oh,
that's
he'll be proud of you.
Yeah, interesting to see.
Yeah.
We've got quite a love for nature in the family, so obviously that's come down from him, I think. So.
Brilliant. It's in the genes.
Yeah.
Good. And we also have Edward Thomas's great-granddaughter, Lucy Milner, here as well, Sophie's mother. What does he mean to you?
Well, I'm very proud. He's a great heritage to have, and I feel that I do carry a little bit of his love of nature. I'm proud of that, yes.
After the readings at the Edward Thomas Memorial Stone, I talked with Colin Thornton, Secretary of the Edward Thomas Fellowship. This memorial stone here on Shoulder of Mutton Down, this was unveiled 30 years after his death.
Correct.
And who by?
It was unveiled by the poet laureate of the time, which was Walter Delamere, and John Masefield was also here.
Who was a close friend of
His close friend.
Yes.
And Helen, his wife, obviously was here. And Lord Horder, who lived at Ashford Chase, just down the hill. Yeah. And it was Lord Horder that gave this hill to the people of Hampshire and England in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. But the stone itself was actually organised by a great appeal. And the secretary was a man called Roland Watson. And he organised bringing this sarsen stone from Wiltshire and getting it placed here and getting the plaque made on side it.
And then it's got Thomas's dates, and it says Edward Thomas, poet. And then down at the bottom, the inscription, and I rose up and knew that I was tired and continued my journey. Now, where does that come from?
It's the final sentence of one of his essays. And it was just considered to be the perfect line. And it is the perfect line.
It is, because it's taking him forward.
It is, yes.
Edward Thomas's journey in pursuit of spring took him through Winchester. I'm there now, or rather I'm on the downs above it, looking down on the city and on its cathedral. It's changed rather a lot over the 100 years, but he records it like this.
The sky was full and sagging, but actually rained little when I started soon after 4 and went on through the Four Worthies. On my left, the low sweep of Easton Down, and the almost windowless high church wall among elms between it and the river. And on my right, arable country, and peewits tumbling over it. Worthy Park, a place of lawns and of elms and chestnuts, adorned the road with an avenue of very branchy elms. At Kingsworthy, just beyond, I might have crossed over and taken the shortest way to Salisbury, that is to say, by Stockbridge. But, except at Stockbridge itself, there is hardly a house on the 20 miles of road, and either one inn or two. Evidently the sky could not long contain itself, and as I knew enough of English inns to prefer not arriving at one wet through, I determined to take the Roman road through Headbourne Worthy to Winchester. This brought me through a region of biggish houses, shrubberies, rookeries, motor cars and carriages, but also down to a brook and a withy bed, and Headbourne Worthy's little church and blunt shingled spire beside it. The blackbirds were singing their best in the hawthorns as I was passing, and in the puddles they were bathing before singing. Winchester Cathedral appeared and disappeared several times, and above it, slightly to the left, St. Catherine's smooth hill and beechen crown. In one of these views I saw what I had never before noticed, that the top of the cathedral tower is apparently higher than the top of St. Catherine's Hill.
Just before the First World War, a community of poets and writers assembled near Dimmock on the Gloucestershire-Herefordshire border in an idyllic countryside dotted with orchards, hedges and wild daffodils. I met up with Roy Palmer of the Friends of the Dimmock Poets to ask about the Dimmock Poets and their significance. Thank you so much for coming along. And Roy, why have you brought me here to this piece of countryside?
Well, this is Leddington, which is just near to Dimmock, and we can see old fields to my right, which is where Thomas rented rooms. Over on the left is Little Iddens, and at Little Iddens, Frost and his family were renting the house. There is a footpath running between them, a little footbridge over a stream, and the two poets are known to have walked and talked across that ground. Thomas knew all the poets before he came here, but that intense period of communication with Frost when they were walking between the two houses turned out to be a climactic moment, because Frost persuaded Thomas that he'd been writing poetry hidden in his copious prose works before then, and that if he took the kernels that were there, he would become a poet. He persuaded Thomas of that, and it duly happened. And Thomas now is one of the brightest lights in the poetic galaxy.
The truth is that they discovered this fantastic, tranquil part of rural Britain, just as the rural idyll, the Edwardian summer, was actually ending. They must have had premonitions, Roy, that the war was coming. Were they seeking escape from it, or what? Have we any ideas?
I don't think they were seeking escape from the war, because everybody knew rumours of war and so on. But they were pursuing their fraternity of poetry. But then war increasingly impinged. I mean, it took the lives of two of them, Thomas and Brooke. So war, in time, shattered their idyll.
As spring was dreaming itself, I travelled to Emmanuel College, Cambridge, to meet up with English scholar, travel writer and fellow Edward Thomas enthusiast, Robert Macfarlane. Robert, why is Edward Thomas now rather suddenly becoming not so much popular as meaningful?
One reason is that we're about to fight the First World War all over again in memory, and Thomas is keenly associated with the war. That's out of which his poems emerged and in which he died. But there are, I think, sharper reasons than that. One is that he felt, he was torn apart by this double longing for living in one place and moving on, as he talked about the tension, the irresolvable tension between those two impulses. And that is a very contemporary feeling, I think, a very contemporary tension. Another is that he found in nature a source of comfort, joy, and relation, but also alienation, a reminder of his own divorce from nature and the natural world. And again, I think we're going through some version of that crisis ourselves now.
Do you think he was ahead of his time?
I do. There's that famous photograph of him taken in 1912 with his chin on his hands, and he's looking out of the photograph, almost at something that's over your shoulder as you look at him. And it took me a long time to work out that actually what he's looking at is the future, is our now. I think he saw that a long time before he lived it.
I am fascinated by this notion of Robert Macfarlane's that Thomas, writing 100 years ago, is looking at the future, our now. I met up with Richard Emeny, chairman of the Edward Thomas Fellowship, to ask him about Thomas's legacy.
Well, I think there are two strands to it. First of all, there's the poems themselves. They were published after his death, and it was his widow, Helen, who promoted him very strongly throughout her life, and it's largely through her, but not entirely, because his poems were appreciated. So that's one area, I think. But the second area is quite simply that he sort of predicated the way in which modern English poetry has gone. And his influence on the way people write poetry these days is colossal. When Ted Hughes unveiled the plaque in Westminster Abbey in Poets' Corner to First World War poets, he gave a speech and talked about the poets, and as far as Thomas was concerned, he quite simply said he was the father of us all.
Thomas was fascinated by paths. They spoke to him of motion, they spoke to him of freedom, and they spoke to him of time. And he returned to them again and again in his poems as a metaphor and as a means of proceeding through the world and of traversing his own complicated mind. And one of his best poems about paths and roads is just called The Path. Running along a bank, a parapet that saves from the precipitous wood below the level road, there is a path. It serves children for looking down the long, smooth steep between the legs of beech and yew to where a fallen tree checks the sight, while men and women content themselves with the road and what they see over the bank and what the children tell. The path, winding like silver, trickles on, bordered and even invaded by thinnest moss that tries to cover roots and crumbling chalk with gold, olive and emerald. But in vain. The children wear it. They have flattened the bank on top and silvered it between the moss with the current of their feet, year after year. But the road is houseless and leads not to school. To see a child is rare there, and the eye has but the road, the wood that overhangs and underyawns it, and the path that looks as if it led on to some legendary or fancied place where men have wished to go and stay, till, sudden, it ends, where the wood ends.
My journey now takes me further westwards to rejoin Edward Thomas's original route in pursuit of spring.
It is not yet spring. Spring is being dreamed, and the dream is more wonderful and more blessed than ever was spring. What the hour of waking will bring forth is not known. Catch at the dreams as they hover.
Edward Thomas was one of the most accomplished and profound writers on the countryside, with a unique poetic prose style. In 1913, Thomas embarked upon what became his last prose journey, In Pursuit of Spring, an account of a 130-mile cycle ride from South London westwards to the Quantocks in Somerset. Thomas undertook this journey over the Easter weekend of 1913. His mission was to find spring, but he saw, found, touched, and achieved much more. I'm Matthew Oates, a naturalist working for the National Trust, follower of the poetic approach to nature, and one long fascinated by Edward Thomas's way of looking at the world. In the previous programme, I began my own journey in Hampshire at the Edward Thomas Memorial Stone. My journey now takes me further west into Wiltshire, where I rejoined Thomas's original route. On leaving Winchester, heading towards Salisbury and bypassing Romsey, Edward Thomas cycled under the shadow of the West Dean Escarpment, writing, "Above all, I wanted to ride along under Dean Hill, the level ridge chalk hill dotted with yew that is seen running parallel to the railway a quarter of a mile on your left as you near Salisbury from Eastleigh." I travelled along that section of his route with ecologist Sophie Lake from Vine, Values in Nature and the Environment, looking for changes and constancies over the course of 100 years. So here, along the West Dean Escarpment, Thomas describes the river and its alders, drab sedges mingled with intense green and with marsh marigolds yellow, and then peewits wheeling over it with creaking wings and protests against the existence of man. Now, Sophie, some changes and some constancies here.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I do wonder what Thomas would have made of it today, and how much his interest in natural history, how he'd have felt about the changes that we've seen here. When you look at the whole landscape, it's the structure of it hasn't changed that much. We've still got the steep escarpment that's chalk, presumably far too steep to have been ploughed up at any point. We've still got the yew trees dotted along there. And then down on the flatter land, the whole landscape unfurls out. Huge, huge arable fields there. We can't see from where we are, but if you actually went down into those fields, they'd be nothing like they were in Thomas's day. I'm thinking about the arable weeds that presumably would have flourished then, and the intensification of agriculture, particularly in the last 60 or 70 years, has seen really big changes and losses in the number of wildflowers that we would have seen out in those fields.
Because he would pick up things like linnets twittering in companies, singing from solitary thorn tips, thrushes singing in the wayside yews, and of course the modern machinery drowns the birdsong, even where the birdsong still exists.
Well, that's the thing, even where it exists. And I must say, one of the things that I've been thinking about today as we've been walking along, considering the changes since Thomas's time, is what I call generational amnesia. This is something that really worries me in my work as a nature conservationist. What I mean by that is that each generation recalibrates according to what they were accustomed to in their own childhood. So today's generation, for example, will look around and they'll see what we've been seeing today, and that for them is normal. That's what they'll feel that they should be trying to look after. And it's heart-wrenching. They have no concept of what went before. They might have got stories, they might now have got photographs and maybe some poems and songs and pictures, but that's not the same as experiencing the real thing. What worries me is that today's children don't know what happened before, and it's probably the same for Thomas. He wasn't aware of the nature that his grandparents knew, and it's diminishing all the time.
After Salisbury and Wilton, Edward Thomas cycled up the Wylye and then the Pill valleys, passing through the village of Berwick St James. There he noted an excellent dense group of cottages and farm buildings by the river, new and old thatched roofs and walls of flint or of black boarding. The church tower peered up on the right, with the mill bestriding the stream. On the left, a white house with blossoming fruit trees. He goes on. The sky overall was dim. And he ends, the street ending in the Boot Inn was a perfect neat one of flint and stone chequer and thatch. The church, he remarks, is kept locked. Well, today, the church is kept open. The sky overall is still very dim indeed. The blossoming fruit trees have gone and are replaced by, would you believe it, alpacas. That apart, the spirit of this village is still absolutely as Thomas described it in 1913. Thomas then headed up onto Salisbury Plain, and I shall follow in his footsteps.
Next to the dead, the most numerous things on the plain are sheep, rooks, peewits, and larks. Today they mingle their voices, but the lark is the most constant. Here, more than elsewhere, he rises up above an earth only less free than the heavens. The peewit is equally characteristic. His winter and twilight cry expresses for most men both the sadness and the wildness of these solitudes. When his spring cry breaks every now and then, as it does today, through the songs of the larks, when the rooks caw in low flight or perched on their elm tops, and the lambs bleat and the sun shines and the couch fires burn well and the wind blows their smoke about, the plain is genial, and the unkindly breath and simplicity of the scene in winter or in the drought of summer are forgotten. But let the rain fall and the wind whirl it, or let the sun shine too mightily, the plain assumes the character by which it is best known, that of a sublime, inhospitable wilderness. It makes us feel the age of the earth, the greatness of time, space, and nature, the littleness of man, even in an aeroplane. The fact that the earth does not belong to man, but man to the earth. And this feeling, or some variety of it, for most men is accompanied by melancholy, or is held to be the same thing. This is perhaps particularly so with townsmen, and above all with writers, because melancholy is the mood most easily given an appearance of profundity, and, therefore, most easily impressive.
Now, Sophie, the plain meant a great deal to Edward Thomas. He described it as a sublime, inhospitable wilderness that makes us feel the age of the earth. Salisbury Plain is also an area of immense archaeological importance. We're standing on a long barrow at the moment, and it just adds to the feel of intense antiquity here, which Edward Thomas really did pick up very strongly. Sophie, how do environmentalists, conservationists view the likes of Salisbury Plain today?
I think it depends who you ask and in what context. And if you ask a conservationist speaking professionally in terms of their organisation, they'll tell you about the size of Salisbury Plain, they'll tell you about the species that are here, and they'll tell you how it's the biggest area of chopped grassland in northwest Europe. But I think if you ask them individually, they would tell you about how it makes them feel. They tell you about what they can see and hear and perhaps smell. They tell you about looking out to the far horizon. And I think if you stand on the edge of Salisbury Plain looking inwards, you have a sense that it's a huge area, but there's a sort of loneliness, there's a feeling at your back, because you know that chalk grassland that once could have continued, or did continue for miles in every direction, is no longer there. And one of the interesting things about Salisbury Plain is why it's still as it is, this huge expanse of semi-natural grassland. And the reason, of course, is that it's a military training area and has been for a long time. So it hasn't experienced the agricultural improvement that the land has on either side. And I think that contributes to its slightly melancholy air in a way, because you look around and you see open tracks and maybe tanks and flags and military paraphernalia. But on the other hand, some of those military exercises have actually contributed to the species that grow here by the disturbance.
I have to confess that the ecologist, the conservationist in me gets rather a feeling of a sense of overwhelming loss here, because 100 years ago or more, and certainly in times of W. H. Hudson, there were vast areas of precisely this, rolling downland on gentle undulating country.
It is, and one of the unique things about Salisbury Plain is that it's an entire landscape. In some ways, you can't see out of it, whereas most of our chalk grassland, you're on, as you say, an escarpment, and you can see the improved grassland, you can see the arable, you can see the roads and the towns, and sure, we can see some roads and buildings, but we're actually right within the landscape, and we can see that to the horizon, and that's precious. In southern England, that's very precious.
On descending from Salisbury Plain, Edward Thomas went to spend the night with friends at the delightfully named Dillybrook Farm on the Wiltshire-Somerset border. Unlike my arrival here, which has been on a most wonderful spring day, Edward arrived after it had grown dark. Today, the landscape is impoverished by traffic intrusions and indeed by some aspects of modern farming. But 100 years ago, this must have been a pastoral heaven.
The road was visible most dimly and was like a pale mist at an uncertain distance. When I reached the green, all was still and silent. The cottages on the opposite side of the road all lay back, and they were merely blacker stains on the darkness. The pollard willows fringing the green, which in the sunlight resemble mops, were now very much like a procession of men, strange primeval beings pausing to meditate in the darkness. The intervals between the cottages were longer here, and still longer. I ceased to notice them until I came to the last house, a small farm, where the dog growled, but in a subdued tone, as if only to condemn my footsteps on the deserted road. Rows of elm trees on both sides of the road succeeded. I walked more slowly and, at a gateway, stopped. While I leaned looking over it at nothing, there was a long silence that could be felt, so that a train whistling 2 miles away seemed as remote as the stars. The noise could not overleap the boundaries of that silence. I was tasting the quiet and the safety without a thought. Night had no evil in it. Though a stranger, I believed that no one wished harm to me. The first man I saw, fitfully revealed by a swinging lantern as he crossed his garden, seemed to me to have the same feeling, to be utterly free of trouble or any care. A man slightly drunk deviated towards me, halted, muttering, and deviated away again. I heard his gate shut, and he was absorbed. The inn door, which was now open, was as the entrance to a bright cave in the middle of the darkness, and a half-seen man within it belonged to a world, blessed indeed, but far different from this one of mine, dark, soft, and tranquil. I felt that I could walk on thus, sipping the evening silence and solitude endlessly. But at the house where I was staying, I stopped, as usual. I entered, blinked at the light, and by laughing at something said with the intention of being laughed at, I swiftly again naturalized myself. I awoke to hear ducklings squeaking and a starling in the pine tree imitating the curlew and the owl hunting. Then I heard another chiff-chaff. Everything more than a quarter of a mile away was hidden by the mist of a motionless white frost, but the blackbird disregarded it. At 7:45, he was singing perfectly in an oak at the crossroads. The sun had melted the frost wherever it was not protected by hedges or fallen trees. Soon a breeze broke up and scattered and destroyed the mist, and I set out on a warm, cloudy morning that could do no wrong.
Edward Thomas wrote profusely. To learn more, I met up with Richard Emeny, the chairman of the Edward Thomas Fellowship, to learn about the scale and scope of Thomas's writing.
Well, the majority of his writing was prose. He certainly was profuse. And of the prose, most of it was actually reviews of other books, other writers.
And so he was a critic.
He was a critic, a feared and respected critic. And he wrote, depending on how you count, anywhere between 1,300 and 1,900 reviews in his lifetime, well over 1 million words. But he also wrote something like 30 plus books of varying types, what you would call vaguely topographical, about the countryside, about his own journeys. Occasional biographies. The one of Richard Jefferies is one that he was particularly keen to do because of the influence of Jefferies. But mainly he regarded them as hack work to make money to support his family.
Yes, but we can't regard In Pursuit of Spring as hack work. Or sure enough, it was commissioned. It was a commissioned piece, but it wasn't hack work. He put his heart and soul into it, didn't he?
Yes. The significant thing about In Pursuit of Spring, I think, is that it was one of the very last pieces of prose that he wrote, by which time he'd honed his prose style. As you say, he did enjoy it, that enjoyment comes through, and although he appears to be alone on the journey, in fact he was accompanied partly for the first half, I think, by his brother, and the second half by a friend. So it was, I think, quite a jolly journey, actually, and that comes through a bit in the book.
But it is poetic prose.
It is poetic prose, and the sort of prose that when Frost said you could take a piece of his prose and chop it about and you've got a poem, he was thinking very much of In Pursuit of Spring.
Yes, so In Pursuit of Spring, well, could be argued as being the jumping off point into his poetry.
Yes, though I think it's fair to say that as more research is being done, it looks as if he was experimenting with poetry rather earlier than we thought.
That's interesting.
Yes, there is a new biography which will be published next year by Jean Millcroft Wilson, and she has certainly found certain experiments a bit earlier than we've normally thought of, which puts Frost's influence in a slightly different perspective as well.
I've deviated slightly off Edward Thomas's cycle route to visit the Richard Jefferies Museum on the edge of Swindon. Thomas was hugely influenced by the writings and indeed the mind of this Victorian naturalist, Richard Jefferies. And Thomas knew Jefferies' heartland, really the Marlborough Downs to the southeast of Swindon, intimately. In Jefferies' day, and indeed in Thomas's day, this would have been a deeply tranquil rural area, not next to a busy link road out to the M4. But who exactly was Richard Jefferies? I've come to the museum to meet up with scholar Rebecca Welshman of Exeter University to discover Jefferies and determine his relevance today. So shall we go inside and reach the still point of the turning world? And I like this room. It's full of interest. So, Rebecca, the farmhouse looked roughly like this in 1907 when Thomas came here.
Yes, it would have looked almost exactly the same as when Thomas came here in 1907. The thatched property on this side of the building was the original building, and Jefferies' grandfather was responsible for extending the property into what we're standing in now.
Who was, or if you prefer, who is Richard Jefferies?
Well, Richard Jefferies is a very interesting character. He was more than just an author. He was a philosopher, a deep thinker, and a very spiritual person. And he unfortunately didn't live very long, similar to Edward Thomas. And most of his output was in a very short 15 to 20 year period. And he was responsible for producing a large number of novels, essay collections, and all sorts of other works.
And I think he very much helped to develop Edward Thomas as a naturalist as well.
Yes, I think that was very important at that time, because Jefferies was one of the first authors to really break into the public sphere with this kind of natural writing. And I'm sure Thomas took great guidance from Jefferies' works as he matured as an author and poet.
So Richard Jefferies really still has great relevance to us today, particularly to nature conservationists and nature lovers.
Absolutely. I think Jefferies' time is coming now, especially with this environmental movement and the increasing respect for the natural world that so many of us are trying to work towards.
So Rebecca, you've been studying Richard Jefferies for a decade now. What are your major findings?
Well, I think with Jefferies there's always something new to discover in his writing. One of the major discoveries I've made is the existence of Jefferies' imitators, who were writing in a very, very similar style to Jefferies in the 1880s when he was at his peak. And the magazines and newspapers for which he was writing suddenly seemed to realise that this could make them a lot of money, and lots of people were contributing very similar articles to Jefferies, almost word-to-word matching.
But Edward Thomas was not a Jefferies imitator, was he?
No, Thomas was different. I think Jefferies affected people in different ways. People who were trying to write like him obviously were trying to imitate him and didn't necessarily succeed. People like Thomas were guided by Jeffreys in a different way because of the spiritual connection that they had with Jeffreys. He deeply moved people with the way he expressed the connection between the human mind and the cadence of nature.
Well, we've come up to All Saints Church below Liddington Hill, which we know both Jeffreys and Thomas visited at this church. And in fact, Thomas records visiting 23 cathedrals and churches during his In Pursuit of Spring journey, which is quite interesting, as I doubt he actually attended that many church services during his adulthood. And yet, Rebecca, both Jeffreys and Thomas were deeply spiritual people, but perhaps their church was, as I call it, the church of nature, perhaps as a sort of a reaction against Darwinism.
Yes, I think you're right there. Jeffreys in particular was writing very much in his own vein of experimental thinking just after 1859, when Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And I think he wanted to develop a deeper, more soulful engagement with nature than what he perceived science to offer at the time. And I think as well the doctrine of the survival of the fittest infiltrated literature and culture of those decades when Jeffreys was writing. And he wanted to represent the individual perspective of animals and the point of contact between the human mind and the natural world.
And you can see very strong parallels there with Edward Thomas as well.
That kind of writing developed pace from 1860s till the early 20th century when Thomas was writing. It became a more refined means of expression, and Thomas in particular saw poetry as a more refined means of expressing these ideas than prose.
He actually describes it as being the natural language of people, as natural as song is to birds at one point. And it's very much a spiritual journey which Thomas was on, even in Pursuit of Spring. Very much so.
I know that Thomas once wrote that Jeffreys' writing at its best was what he called pure spirit, whether this be the spirit of the hills, the fields, the agricultural labourer, the same kind of spirit that ran through them all, was at the heart of them all. For Jeffreys and for Thomas, the smallest thing was significant, whether it was a leaf or the note of a bird or the breeze among the treetops. Jeffreys saw into things from the perspective of the individual. And I think both authors recognised that human intellectual systems sometimes couldn't adequately explain the complexity of nature, and they saw something more behind it. They felt something more behind it.
Absolutely, very much so. That's what they were all about. And that's lacking, though, from modern nature writing.
I think a lot of it must be to do with the pressures of the modern age, because with both authors, who were both very strongly creative, they felt that the routine of ordinary work seemed to deaden the spirit, and it wasn't what living, what they called real living, was about. They felt that the direct experience of nature was a much more powerful way to exist.
My journey into In Pursuit of Spring is giving me a deeper understanding of the book, so I wonder, what is Richard Emine's own take on it?
To be honest, I find it fun. Apart from what we've said about it being a pathway to poetry, and there are some very amusing pieces in it. He makes fun of very ponderous and pompous church tombstone verses and so on, but also when he's in Wells in Somerset, he records a conversation between a brother and sister. The sister, one gathers, is about 12, and the girl...
Tomboy.
Yes, as a tomboy, yes. And it's delightful, and it's something quite different for Thomas, I think. There's quite a lot in that book which is new.
He becomes happier and happier, I think. During the course of that journey, he leaves London and everything it enshrines behind. And as he gets closer into the romantic poetry landscape of Coleridge and Wordsworth, he just seems to ease up, doesn't he? He becomes happier.
I think the country always did that for him. It's interesting the number of books that he wrote about other places which start off by leaving London and how I despised London, and it clearly had a great grip on him and was a weight on his shoulders. And you do find that, and it's particularly true with In Pursuit of Spring, that the further away he gets from London, the more relaxed he is, the more easygoing he is, and
the more he becomes himself.
The more he becomes himself, yes.
Was he actually pursuing spring, or was he actually taking winter and all the stuff and nonsense it represented to him as far away as he possibly could and burying it?
Probably true, yes. He arrived at the end of his journey before spring had really begun, yes. And he makes that point right at the end of the book. But there are the first burgeonings of spring there at Cothelstone on top of the Quantocks, and that's where he found the beginnings of spring. Yes, it's as if he's going into a much sunnier, better sort of climb.
After descending from the Mendips, Edward Thomas spent the night in Shepton Mallet, where dinner, bread and breakfast cost him a mighty 4 shillings, brackets 20 pence in today's money. He then travelled to Wells Cathedral, which he particularly wanted to see, and there he wrote, "Rooks inhabited the elm tops, and swans the water. Rooks are essential to a cathedral anywhere." Well, I've travelled here today on a glorious spring day. Really, today is the first day of spring. Sadly, the elms have long gone, but the rooks have migrated maybe 200 metres into a nearby park where they have established a mighty rookery.
It was 10:30 on a beautiful morning when I rode out of the town by a very suburban suburb of villas, elms and a cemetery. My road carried me at first along a low ridge, so that over the stone walls I looked down east and northward to the Vale of the Parrot. A misty, not quite flat expanse of green, alternating with reddish and already crumbling ploughland, which was interrupted a mile away by the red walls, elms, and orchard of Chiltern Trinity, and, farther off, by the pale church tower of Cannington. 2 horses were drawing a scarifier across the furrows of a field by the roadside. On my left, or westward, I looked beyond a more broken country, with white linen blowing on cottage garden bushes, to the dim Quantocks still far off. The sun was hot, but the wind blew from behind me, and the dust was not an offence when a motor car was not passing me. A chiff-chaff was singing at Wemden. Larks crowded their songs into a maze in every quarter. Overhead, a single telegraph wire sizzled.
Like Thomas, then, my journey now takes me closer towards the Quantock Hills in Somerset, in pursuit of spring.
It is not yet spring. Spring is being dreamed, and the dream is more wonderful and more blessed than ever was spring. What the hour of waking will bring forth is not known. Catch at the dreams as they hover.
Edward Thomas was one of the most accomplished and profound writers on the countryside, with a unique poetic prose style. In 1913, Thomas embarked upon what became his last prose journey, In Pursuit of Spring, an account of a 130-mile cycle ride from South London westwards to the Quantocks in Somerset. Thomas undertook this journey over the Easter weekend of 1913. His mission was to find spring, but he saw, found, touched, and achieved much more. I'm Matthew Oates, a naturalist working for the National Trust, follower of the poetic approach to nature, and one long fascinated by Edward Thomas's way of looking at the world. In the previous programmes, I have followed Edward Thomas's route across southern England. My journey now takes me to the Quantocks in Somerset, the destination of Edward Thomas's pilgrimage. Edward Thomas deeply valued Coleridge as a poet and especially as a mind and imagination, a kindred spirit in the world of poetic nature, where nature has a capital N. And Thomas journeyed past Coleridge Cottage 100 years ago, but wasn't able to venture inside. The cottage, and indeed this area of the Quantocks, was very much the zenith of Thomas's poetic pilgrimage. I met with Justin Shepherd, chairman of the Friends, to discuss the modern significance of Coleridge. Justin, shall we venture inside?
Yes, let's. But before we go in, I'd just like to point out the plaque here on the outside, which reads, "Here Samuel Taylor Coleridge made his home 1797 to 1800. And that plaque must have been put up very shortly after the cottage was acquired by the National Trust in 1909.
So Thomas noted it in Pursuit of Spring.
Nether Stowey begins with a church and a farm and farmyard in a group. Then follows a street of cottages without front gardens, dominated by a smooth green castle rampart a third of a mile away. The street ends in a first and last inn on one side and a cottage on the other, announced as formerly Coleridge's by an inscription and a stone wreath of dull reddish brown. Altogether, Nether Stowey offered no temptations to be compared with those of the road leading out of it. Immediately outside the village it was walled by deep banks, and on these grew arum, celandine and nettle, with bushes of new-leaved blackthorn and spindle. Here I saw the first starry white stitchworts or milkmaids, and henceforward I was always walking steeply up or steeply down one of the medley of lesser hills. Below on the right was chiefly red ploughland, above on the left wilder and wilder heights of sheep-fed moorland. The road was visible ahead, looping halfway up the slopes. Honeysuckle ramped on the banks of the deep-worn road in such profusion as I had never before seen. The sky had clouded softly, and the sun warmed misty woods of the combes, the noise of slender waters threading them, the exuberant young herbage, the pure flowers such as stitchwort, and the pink and silver-white cuckoo flowers, but above all the abounding honeysuckle, produced an effect of wildness and richness, purity and softness so vivid that the association of Nether Stowey was hardly needed to summon up Coleridge. The mere imagination of what these banks would be like when the honeysuckle was in flower was enough to suggest the poet.
So Justin, we come into the parlour room where Coleridge wrote some mighty fine poetry.
Absolutely, and above all for me, this room is the room where he almost certainly wrote or certainly imagined that great poem, Frost at Midnight, written late one night, looking after his son in the crib and with his family asleep upstairs, staring at the fire, in which he produced or thought about, imagined Frost at Midnight, the poem which to me is the quintessence of Coleridgean romanticism.
Edward Thomas was highly regarded as a literary critic, including of poetry. Why do you think he was so strongly attracted towards Coleridge?
I can think of several reasons, but one very strong attraction, I think, is because they shared, at a very fundamental level, a sort of split nature. Both of them were fascinated by the variety of the landscape of nature. I mean, both, for example, mention specific flowers, and you get the very strong impression that Coleridge looked very directly at nature. But on the other hand, they were both drawn to a sort of metaphysical, spiritual quality in themselves, yes, and in the world around them. So that's a very important connection. The second thing, I feel that when Thomas was coming down here on his journey, he was finding his way towards his own voice in poetry. And I think what he responded to in Coleridge was this conversational tone, this personal voice. In his quotations, in his writing about Coleridge, he tracks how Coleridge moves out of 18th century diction into something more real, something more conversational. And I'm sure that Thomas responded to that. Another thing is, I think they both loved the country. They regarded the city as a trap. They felt a tremendous sense of release.
Running water led me seaward, through a tangled thicket of scrub oak, gorse and bramble, filled in with teasel and burdock, and through a small, marshy flagbed. A low cliff, pierced by the stream, separates the beach from the rough, undulating, briary pasture. This cliff of sand and rock gave me shelter from the wind. The flat, grey pebbles gave me a seat, and I looked out to sea. A ragged sky hung threatening over a sea that was placid but corrugated and of the colour of slate, having a margin of black at the horizon. The water was hardly distinguishable save by its motion from the broad beach of grey pools, blackened pebbles and low rock edges. Only the most fleeting and narrow lights fell upon the expanse, now on a solitary sail, now on the pale lighthouse of Flatholme, far out. Between this island, which just broke the surface of the sea on the left, and Breen Down, the last outpost of the mainland on the right, the cloudy pile of Steepholme towered up. The Kilve Brook on my left was noisily twisting over the pebbles and the slanting, grey, mossy-weeded rock down to the sea, tossing up a light but unceasing spray, and pied wagtails flitted from the fresh water to the salt over the rocks. But what I was most glad to see was the meadow pipit. Feebly, like a minor lark, and silently, he launched himself 20 or 30 feet up from the wet, dark rock. Then, with wings uplifted and body curved to a keel like a crescent, he descended slantwise, singing the most passionate and thrilling suite of all songs that inform this tenement of clay, until he alighted. Before one had finished, another began, and not a moment was the song silenced. Here, too, and among the briars of the rough pasture behind the cliff, the wheatear, as clean as a star, flirted his tail and showed his whiteness.
Well, we've come down to Kilve Beach, the rocky mudstone shore on the edge of the Bristol Channel, the channel which inspired Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. But Thomas came here as part of his magnetic attraction towards the Quantocks. Justin, as a Coleridge scholar, what do you think the legacy of Edward Thomas might be?
Well, Thomas is in a line which stretches from Coleridge, Hardy, Thomas, and perhaps up to Ted Hughes, of people who've engaged in a fresh and genuine way with nature, and whose voice, however, hasn't stayed in the past, whose voice continues. And Thomas's voice has become more and more significant for writers, people like Larkin and Hughes himself. They've all drawn upon Thomas's legacy. It's impossible not to be moved by the idea of this Edwardian writer with his tweed clothes and his walking stick, his life snuffed out by the war. But his life didn't end there. His tone of voice, his modern distinctive tone, has lasted, and its influence has grown. Larkin, Hughes, everybody since Thomas, I think, has responded to this very distinctive voice, which was quiet, but which has grown in significance since his death.
Edward Thomas did not have to join up during World War I, but his integrity and love of country made him enlist in July 1915, even though at the age of 37 he was exempt. His friends tried to dissuade him from enlisting, but when his friend Eleanor Farjong asked him why he wanted to, Thomas picked up a handful of earth and said simply, "For this." I asked Colin Thornton, Secretary of the Edward Thomas Fellowship, what happened to Thomas when he got to the Western Front.
When he was at the observation point, he was, just before his death, considered almost to be a lucky talisman because a shell fell by the side of him, didn't explode, it was a dud. Well, you don't get any luckier than that.
But the way he was actually killed, he wasn't blown to bits, was he?
No.
Very strange.
It was from a passing shell. The shell must have come in very close proximity to his body, and the shockwave would have stopped his heart and decompressed his lungs. And yet you can see this, the strength of this wave that went by, because the war diary that Edward kept, he kept in his breast pocket, and that was where it was found after his death. And on close examination, it was found to contain a very curious scallop shell pattern of ridges. And this compression mark is all the way through it, right from the middle of the diary right back to the spine.
How long did he last at the Western Front?
He actually went from, they moved on the 29th of January 1917. He was killed at the first Battle of Arras on Easter Monday 1917. So you're just talking basically 3 months. And the life was sucked out of the greatest of English poets.
Turning to the left again when the signpost declared it 7 3/4 miles to Bridgewater, I found myself on a glorious sunlit road, without hedge, bank or fence on either side, proceeding through fern, gorse and ash trees scattered over mossy slopes. The sun had both dried the turf and warmed it. The million gorse petals seemed to be flames sown by the sun. By the side of the road were the first bluebells and cowslips. They were not growing there, but some child had gathered them below at Stowey or Durley, and then, getting tired of them, had dropped them. They were beginning to wilt, but they lay upon the grave of winter. I was quite sure of that.
My personal journey with Edward Thomas in pursuit of spring ends here on the rocky shores of Kilve Beach on the first real day of spring, staring into the sunset over the Exmoor coast. But Edward Thomas went much further than me. He ascended to the top of Cottleston Hill, almost the summit of the Quantocks. And there he buried winter. He didn't just find spring, he buried winter and all the stuff and nonsense it represented to him.
I had found winter's grave. I had found spring. And I was confident that I could ride home again and find spring all along the road. Perhaps I should hear the cuckoo by the time I was again at the Avon, and see cowslips tall on ditch sides and short on chalk slopes, bluebells in all hazel copses, orchises everywhere in the lengthening grass, and flowers of rosemary and crown imperial in cottage gardens, and in the streets of London cowslips, bluebells, and the unflower-like yellow-green spurge. Thus I leapt over April and into May, as I sat in the sun on the north side of Cothelstone Hill on that 28th day of March, the last day of my journey westward to find the spring.
In Pursuit of Spring was presented by Matthew Oates, with readings by Robert Macfarlane. It was produced in the Natural History Unit in Bristol by Andrew Dawes.